So it's all you, Dwayne.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashley, and welcome everybody. I want to give a big shout out to our sponsors also. They've been wonderful. This will be the last of the 8 podcasts for 2022 now, with another one, I think, to come in the spring. As I said, we'll talk to Ashley and the powers that be here, but we've had an overwhelming response. We've had 180 people register for this, the magic of Zoom. I want to echo again what Ashley said. Pete Dunda is going to be playing the Christmas polka party at the museum at 5 o'clock on December the 28th. That's a week from tomorrow. And Pete does a fantastic job. And an informational note, Ashley O'Hara and I are nearly finished with the oral history of ranching in the Gunnison country. We've interviewed 10 ranchers. We got about 4 more to go. And I think Ashley will have those available to be looked at by people. Ashley, why don't you comment on that?
So those interviews are all going to be utilized in an exhibit that will be ready probably Memorial Day weekend. That's the hope. And it will be on ranching, but the focus will be how our ranchers are conservationists and our environmentalists in the valley. And it'll also focus on ranching above 7,000 feet. And it will cover all of the Gunnison country, just not Crested Butte.
Thanks, Ashley. And then while Ashley is here, I want to thank her and the Crested Butte Museum for the great job that they've done in making this podcast possible. It's been wonderful. So here we go. This is the final episode, the coal mines and towns around Crested Butte that made Crested Butte famous. Crested Butte began in 1879 as the gateway to the Elk Mountains. It was the jumping off point and the supply center for all the great silver camps which sprang up around it. Irwin, Gothic, Schofield, Pittsburgh, and Crystal, and many others whose dreams ended after a few months. When the precious metal mining boom ended with the silver panic of 1893, Crested Butte turned to its destiny, and its destiny was coal. This town, deep in the Elk Mountains, almost 9,000 feet high, soon became the 3rd greatest coal town in Colorado. The coking coal produced here helped convert iron into steel at Pueblo, and it helped to power the Industrial Revolution in the United States. The coal mines of Crested Butte involve valuable resources, ethnic immigrants, heavy snow and cold weather, altitude, and the incredible beauty of the Elk Mountains. Tonight, we're going to look at the coal mines and towns of Crested Butte and the surrounding area. And our first mine in town is one of the earliest in the history of the Elk Mountains, and that is the one that is Smith Hill Anthracite, better known to locals as Cloud City because of its elevation. That history began in 1879 when a man named Howard Smith, the father of Crested Butte, purchased all of Smith Hill, named after him, obviously. It was above the Slate River, 4 miles north of Crested Butte, and about 1,600 feet above the river. Smith, with 2 others, bought the hill because of the high-quality anthracite coal there. Anthracite coal is hard coal. Bituminous coal, that we're going to talk about a little later on, is soft coal. It was known then by locals as Cloud City, and it was up in the clouds, very high elevation. And there you get a great picture of the anthracite coal breaker. More about that in a moment. The coal mine began in December of 1882, and the Rio Grande Railroad around that time completed a 4-mile spur there from Crested Butte. A great coal breaker, and you're looking at it, 80 feet high, built with 360,000 feet of timber, was built below on the floor of the Slate River in January of 83. The breaker along the Denver and Rio Grande line was called anthracite. So where the mine was up above, that's Smith Hill. The breaker is anthracite down below. It was the largest coal breaker west of Pennsylvania. On top of Smith Hill, a 200-foot long track ran from the mouth of the anthracite mine to the head of a very steep tramway. The tram ran 1,628 feet from the mine to the breaker, down a very steep incline of 33 degrees, the longest and steepest in Colorado, a gravity tram. And there you get a great look at it. You can see the railroad tracks going in, you can see the breaker, and then you can see the tramway going up. And it was a gravity tram. The full coal cars coming down the tram pulled the empty cars going back up. Once in the breaker, the large chunks of coal were broken up in a crusher, and then they passed into a revolving screen with meshes which filtered through 5 different sizes. And the sizes were fish, orange, nut, pea, and slack or waste. By 1884, Smith had sold out to the Colorado Coal and Iron Company out of Pueblo. Later on, that would be known as the CF&I, or the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. By then, 200 people lived at Smith Hill, which had a post office, school, library, along with many cabins for the miners. Life there was very hard and dangerous. Early in the morning of January the 31st, 1883, an avalanche smashed into one of the boarding houses, killing 6 and injuring 15. Between 1882 and 1903, when it temporarily shut down, the mine employed 70 and turned out an average of 5,000 tons of coal a month. After it shut down in 1903, a new company, the Anthracite Mesa Coal Company, ran the mine for the next 4 years, from 1904 to 8. From 1908 to 13, it didn't operate. The mine opened up again in 1914 when World War I broke out with an increased demand for coal. In that year, despite a fire which destroyed the giant coal breaker, new owner Frank Buckley built a new one and ran the mine again. The mine did well during World War I, but another fire in 1923 destroyed the new breaker, but the mine thrived into the 1920s. Finally, the Depression, which began in October of 1929, along with high transportation costs and the coming of gas and electricity, ended the mine. The miners left and they went to work at the big mine in Crested Butte. However, Smith Hill and Anthracite had one more card to play. The huge slack coal dump by the breaker, thought to be worthless by locals, was bought in the 1940s by the Empire Zinc Company and the American Smelting and Refining Company. They bought that $400,000 dump for $1.25 a ton for use in steel fluxing process, which greatly helped the local economy. Now, that picture you're looking at is 1972. That's a bunch of my friends and I, and that's when the breaker was still, some of the ruins were there, and that's when the coal cars came out on that and then went down that big steep tram down to the Reading Railroad down below. So if you figure 400,000 tons at $1.25 a ton, that's a lot of money that greatly helped the local economy. In 1947, the 4-mile spur from Crested Butte to Anthracite was torn up, and it ended the history of Smith Hill and Anthracite. Today, only remnants of the mine and a great coal breaker exist. The next great mine that we had in this area is the biggest of them all, appropriately known as the Big Mine. The Jennings brothers found coal in Crested Butte in 1879. They sold out to Howard Smith and Sant Robinson 2 years later in 1877. Smith and Robinson then sold the coal land to the CF&I a couple of years later. Crested Butte, it seemed, was full of coal everywhere. The Jokerville mine just west of town, the Pershing and the Peanut on the lower loop, Floresta 12 miles west of town, the Pueblo, the Buckley, and the Robinson just to the south of town, Smith Hill 4 miles up the Slate, and then the largest of them all, the one we're going to talk about right now, the Big Mine on the Bench, just above Crested Butte to the south. William Jackson Palmer's Denver and Rio Grande Railroad arrived in Crested Butte in November of 1881, ensuring the success of Crested Butte and its coal deposits. He was the head of the CF&I, and he operated out of Pueblo, and he needed coal for steel mills and also to run his railroad. Now, there you get a great shot of the building of the CF&I Big Mine at Crested Butte. You see the mountain in the background. This is 1893, early 1894 when they built it. Now, the Big Mine, unlike Smith Hill Anthracite, was bituminous, soft coal, and operated from 1894 to 1952. Inside of the mine, south of town, were 7 miles of underground tunnels and trackage. 400 men were employed. and they were typical of Tennessee Ernie Ford's award-winning song, 16 Tons, which I quote a few lines. I load 16 tons, and what do I get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. The Big Mine was the third largest coal mine in Colorado, and there you get a great look at it. On the left, you see the coke ovens, 154 of them. You can see the steps, that white area there, right about the right middle. Those are 152 steps that people use to get up on the bench. And there you can see the tipple, and you can see the railroad as it came underneath the tipple to collect the coal from the Big Mine. 70 mules worked in the mine pulling coal cars out. Each one cost $200, a lot more than a man. As I mentioned last week, a mule cost $200. If a man got killed, it was $10 to the flower fund, maybe a couple of bucks to the family, and then you bring another immigrant in. The yearly payroll was $400,000. That's about $35,000 a month. The initial workers were Cousin Jacks. Now, remember what I talked about last week, the Cousin Jacks? They are the Protestant English-speaking people from Wales and Ireland and Scotland, etc. And they were called Cousin Jacks because if one person died in the mine, the guy would go up to the foreman and say, hey, my cousin Jack can do that. And another guy was on the way. Their wives were called Cousin Jennies. The Southeast Europeans came into Crested Butte. They'd never worked in the coal mines in Southeastern Europe. They were farmers, vineyard workers, and they came into the 1890s with names like Sedmak, Saya, Panyon, Krismanich, and Capuchin. There's another look at the CF&I Big Mine, and you can see the big mule barn there on the left side of the photograph. Crested Butte was a near company town with a company store, company housing, 25 buildings on 6th Street, script, and the company store is still there today. Now, the original place of the company store was where the Princess Theater is today. And then it was moved over to its present location and burned down in 1937. It was rebuilt. When the coal company left in 1952, Paul Johnston, a man from Oklahoma, turned it into an emporium, kind of a shopping center that didn't work. Before that, it was called the Playground, a dance hall. And today, of course, it's still there with some businesses in it. Deaths in the mine, in the Big Mine, were common. I figure about 100 miners died in accidents in the 58-year history of the mine. You're looking at a great shot there of the 25 or so company houses. That's where a lot of the workers lived. Miners made $3 a day in the 1890s, more later, and if you work by the ton, you could make $5 to $6 a day. Above the mine was Gibson Ridge, with almost all of the trees cut down for mine props, railroad ties, and cabins. It was a great place for the young people to ski. There again, you get a great picture of the railroad cars down below and the tipple where the coal came out onto the railroad cars, and then on they went to Pueblo, Colorado. Pollution was a problem, and it came primarily from clear-cutting the timber up above, the pollution of Coal Creek, and the smog from the coke ovens. There were 154 of the coke ovens before the Big Mine, or below the Big Mine, and along the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad tracks. 40 men worked there. It was the hottest and dirtiest job at the Big Mine, and the earliest immigrant arrivals got those jobs. There you get a great shot of some of the mules that worked in the mine pulling the coal cars out, and the mule barn over on the right. The ovens, the coke ovens, were made of fire brick and encased with stone. They were all connected by a large track which ran next to the oven openings, allowing the coal to be drawn to them by mule. That is a great shot of the coke ovens right there, and you can see the railroad tracks and railroad cars down below, and you can see some of the coal up above. That's slack coal that's going to be taken into the ovens. The coal used was slack, as I mentioned. The lump coal was shipped in the original form. That's hard coal shipped out, or the soft coal shipped out. The ovens were heated red hot before the coal was dumped in. It then baked for 48 hours. Then the ovens were allowed to cool. There's another great shot of the coke ovens at Crested Butte. The coke, when it cooled, was then loaded by fork onto railroad cars next to the ovens and taken to Pueblo to be used in the making of steel. Now, I've talked about this before, but I'm going to talk about it again. Coking coal from Crested Butte drove out some of the impurities when made red hot. Limestone from the limestone quarry at the east side of Monarch Pass. Molten iron from Trinidad. All came together at the CF&I steel mills in Pueblo. And then Henry Bessemer of England had invented the blast furnace in 1856, blasting air into the furnace with the coke and the lime and the iron. And that is how the final transformation was made in converting iron into steel to really make the Industrial Revolution in the United States a success. The intense heat and the dangerous fumes made the oven tender's job one of the least desirable in the coal industry. And they get a good look at the size of those ovens. They're big. And as I said, the coking coal baked in there for about 48 hours. The major vein in the big mine was 5.5 feet by 24 feet thick, which the miners loved because it was big enough to stand up when you worked. The workings extended south over a cover of rock 2,000 feet thick. The roof of the mine was shale overlain by massive sandstone. The coal in the big mine was high grade and much wanted and took a lot of timbering. The method of mining was called room and pillar. The rooms were 25 feet wide, 400 feet long. When they were mined out, the rooms were allowed to collapse. Ventilation came from exhaust fans 11 feet 6 inches in diameter. Explosive gases occurred in some places in the mine. No matches were allowed. Safety lamps were required. Another great shot of the early days of the big mine. Now you look in the background, you can see that there's a lot of room between some of the houses in Crested Butte. And that was in the 1890s or so. The coal inside was sheared by hand with no shooting allowed because of the danger of explosions. Electricity came to the big mine in 1930. 200 wooden mine cars of 3,000 pounds capacity were used. From the pit mouth, the coal went by gravity incline to the tipple, which was located so that the coal could be loaded onto railroad cars or sent to the coke ovens. A fire in 1909 burned the engine house and several buildings outside, and the mine had to close for 30 days. Same thing happened in 1921. Strikes at the big mine were common. 1891, which caused Sheriff Pat Hanlon to come in from Gunnison to put it down. They get a good look at a couple of the miners in the big mine in the 1890s. Another strike, 1903 and 4. One in 1913 and 14, and one in 1927. The strikes came primarily because of wages, hours a day, safety, but most of all because of collective bargaining. The miners wanted to be represented by the United Mine Workers, and the CF&I did not like unions. They called them a conspiracy. The big mine was the #1 employer in Crested Butte for 58 years. It all came to an end in 1952 when the CF&I closed the mine. The reasons for the demise of the big mine were many. Oil and gas took over for coal, high transportation costs. A lot of the coal now was used out of Trinidad. In 1955, the Denver and Rio Grande took out the railroad tracks. In 1967, the high school closed in Crested Butte. Crested Butte's population went to 300. The Denver Post said it was on its way to becoming a ghost town. Lots sold for $50, houses for $500. It costs a little bit more than that now. And that ended the history of the big mine. And now we come to probably the most famous mine in Crested Butte's history, and that was the Jokerville. The Jokerville bituminous mine opened in 1881, a quarter mile west of the center of town. It was connected to the coke ovens below by railroad track. The first coking coal had been done in pits, but in 1883, 50 coke ovens of fired brick encased with stone had been built for the Jokerville. By 1884, 30 men were employed by the Colorado Coal and Iron Company at the ovens. 120 men worked inside the Jokerville. 24 hours a day they worked, with 3 shifts of 8 hours each. The best coking coal in Crested Butte came from the Jokerville. By 1884, 175 tons of coke a day was turned out, 3,000 tons a week. We've already talked about the significance of coking coal and the Industrial Revolution. It was a cold morning on January the 24th, 1884 in Crested Butte. The second shift of miners had finished work at 7 a.m., and they greeted the first shift as they entered the mine. A half hour later at 7:30, a tremendous explosion rocked the Jokerville. 100 feet of the frame tipple leading into the mine was destroyed. One of the fans which supplied needed ventilation and air inside the mine was gone. Now you're looking at a great drawing by an artist from Harper's Weekly magazine of New York who came out to cover the Jokerville explosion. And you can see the little blurb on the bottom, the scene of the disaster. Several of the buildings outside of the Jokerville were on fire, and a fire belched forth from the mine entrance. The dangerous accumulation of gas inside prevented any rescue work. Most of the cousin Jacks working inside the mine never had a chance. However, Johnny Cashin, working in Chamber 4 with 10 other men, 1,800 feet from the entrance, kept his head and began leading his men towards the mine opening. All felt their way along, stumbling over rocks, timbers, mine cars, coal, and corpses of fellow miners. Amazingly, after a half hour of groping along, the men reached the opening, and a great cheer went up from those waiting anxiously outside. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for others. But sadly, there was not. 61 cousin Jacks died in the mine, with names like Coughlin, Donegan, Maroney, O'Neill, Walsh, McDonald, and Murray. Men working in chambers 1 and 2 were all dead because of the explosion, badly mutilated. Others died because the fan giving ventilation was destroyed. Unfortunately, 17 miners, uninjured by the blast, had worked their way to within 200 feet of the mine entrance when they ran out of air and died. Miners came from Baldwin and Anthracite and from hard rock mines nearby to get the bodies out. 38 hours after the blast, 34 bodies were brought out in mine cars past grieving family members. The bodies with an identification tag attached to the breast of everybody who could be identified were moved from the mine to the blacksmith shop. Not until February the 2nd were the last of the 61 bodies brought out of the mine. The coroner's report showed that the men had been badly mangled with heads smashed, limbs broken, and holes clear through many of the bodies. The Jokerville disaster was the worst mine accident up to that time in Colorado history, and still today, the 3rd worst in Colorado history. The worst was the explosion in the Hastings mine outside of Trinidad on April 27, 1917, which killed 121 miners. 46 miners were buried 5 days after the blast in a common grave on the northwest side of the Crested Butte Cemetery, with 3 feet of snow on the ground and a howling blizzard outside. The coroner's report, after 7 days of hearings, said that the explosion had been in Chamber 2, caused by gas coming into contact with naked light. Professor Arthur Lakes of Colorado School of Mines, that investigated the mine, said that the Jokerville had been a very dangerous one. The roof, he said, was poor, and a ticking sound was heard constantly from the escape of gases in the mine. Lakes also said that as mining went deeper, coal gases had increased, and a need for much better ventilation was needed. He declared, and I quote, "Doubtless the coal of this mine contained the greatest amount of dangerous gas in the state." The Colorado Coal and Iron Company chose the jury investigating the explosion, and many who wanted to testify were not allowed to. John Gallagher, who had worked in the Jokerville, said that although the fans supplied more air than the law required, much of it escaped up the main shaft before it could be distributed. There was no doubt the Colorado Coal and Iron Company was guilty of gross negligence, and here are 5 reasons why. First, the coroner, a man named Snyder, was an employee of the company. Secondly, the foreman from Anthracite, who removed the dead, condemned the CC&I for negligence, but he wasn't called as a witness. Thirdly, John Gibson, the foreman in the mine, had only been there 6 times in a year because he considered it too dangerous. Number 4, the law required that 2 entries of a mine be 300 feet apart, but the Jokerville entrances were only 60 feet apart. And number 5, James Richardson, superintendent and responsible for checking gas, had been fired for neglect of duty a year before by the CC&I and was then rehired a few days before the explosion. Miners came from Baldwin and Anthracite to carry the dead miners out. At Baldwin, only 5 of 65 showed up for work there. They instead came to Gunnison and then by train to Crested Butte. 12 hired a sleigh when a special train couldn't be hired. The CC&I prevented this because it was afraid of the miners. On January the 28th, 4 funerals took place. The Masons buried John Rutherford, and the Oddfellows buried Dan McDonald, Jason Lanks, and John Smith. On January 29th, 46 miners were buried in a common grave at the Crested Butte Cemetery. Now there again, you get a good look at a Harper's Weekly drawing. These are the guys that are in the blacksmith shop with a tag on their breast if they could be identified. And those are some of the grieving widows. And then on the bottom right, you can see the miners carrying some of the bodies out. Funeral services now began at City Hall in the afternoon, and the Protestants took 30 minutes for a service. And then Father Quinn of the Catholic Church took an hour before a crowded City Hall, with many standing outside in the cold. At 3 p.m., the procession formed in front of the Elk Mountain House. The order as they moved to the cemetery was like this: first, sleighs with coffins, then miners in charge of Foreman Gibson, then officers in charge of Sheriff Doc Shores of Gunnison, then friends and citizens, and then Father Quinn and his altar boys. The Elk Mountain pilot declared, quote, "It is very stormy here today, and the ceremonies have been carried out with great difficulty. The snow to the cemetery was 3 feet deep on the level, and no road was broken. Despite this, most of the citizens of Crested Butte walked to the cemetery." The newspaper said, quote, "Several of the remains were transferred to the depot to be shipped east. The last 2 bodies, Tom Roberts and John Thomas, were found on February the 2nd. The miners who died in the Jokerville were typical of many of the coal miners in the U.S. then. They worked for slave wages, paid in scrip, lived in company houses, shopped at the company store. Many were cheated on the amount of coal they mined because they didn't speak the English language very well, and obviously they worked in very dangerous conditions. The Jokerville mine never reopened. It was allowed to fill up with water. Some of the best coking coal in the state is still there. 1 year later, in 1885, a new opening was made 60 feet above the old vein, but it was still very dangerous because of gas. That mine was worked for 9 years and then closed in 1895 because of the gas and because the coal vein had narrowed to 8 feet. The Crested Butte paper said this in honor of the men and where they had worked. I'm quoting now. "While rising sheer across the sky in all its matchless majesty, defiant of the ages sped, the butte uplifts its crested head. In granite armor strong and gray, the sentinel still guards the way. Solomon still it seems to be, looking into futurity." You know, a couple of years ago, the people of Crested Butte got together under a lady named Williams, I forget her first name right now, who was the city clerk or assistant city clerk, And they did a great job of doing a renovation of the mine blast and the miners who were buried in the Crested Butte Cemetery. And Kay Flint, who was the daughter of a coal miner, gave a brilliant talk, and I had to give a talk after her, and I told her, I said, Kay, that's the last time I'm talking after you. Such a great talk she gave. Most of the men who died in the explosion were single. 6 miners had families living in Crested Butte. Money and food for widows, including $1,000 from William Jackson Palmer of the Rio Grande, was given. It was apportioned according to children per family, each family getting about $65 a head. 2 boys, Tommy Lyle and William Neath, 12 years old, were killed in the explosion on the outside. They were gatekeepers. And Morgan Neath, only 17, was a driver, and he also died. Colonel Michael DeCourcy, prominent citizen of Crested Butte, was quoted in the Rocky Mountain News as saying the mine disaster was a great financial loss to merchants. Plus, it kept other miners from working while cleanup of the Jokerville came. I'm quoting him now. He said it put a temporary damper on the camp. Evidently, the Jokerville disaster was just minor to him. The Colorado Coal and Iron Company telegraphed around the country to find families of the dead. One writer to the local paper later referred to the Jokerville as, and I quote, the slaughter pen of the Colorado Coal and Iron Company. Now from the Jokerville, we move to another great coal mine in the Gunnison country, Floresta. The top anthracite in the mine in the history of Crested Butte was located 12 miles west of town near Anthracite Creek and its head, and the original name is ruby anthracite. Anthracite coal was first found there in 1879. 8 years later, John Kebler of the CC&I Steel Company in Pueblo bought it for the company. And now you all get a good idea how Kebler Pass got named, because Kebler Pass is very, very close to Floresta. The name of the coal camp was changed to Floresta in 1901. It's Spanish for forest or country estate. Ruby anthracite or Floresta had a tough history. It was located at around 10,000 feet in one of the great snow areas of the Gunnison country and was very isolated. And there you get a great shot of 3 engines with a rotary blade trying to force their way through to Floresta during the spring in the early 1900s. Every year, coal operations came to a near halt around November and December as heavy snow shut down rail traffic. The Denver and Rio Grande ran a 12-mile branch line, narrow gauge, into Floresta in 1893. Even snorting double and triple headers using a rotary plow could not smash through the drifts of snow. There you get a good shot of the train by Splains Gulch. At that time, it was called Rogers in the early 1900s. By 1900, Floresta had a post office, 100 miners employed at the mine, 250 residents. The Colorado Coal and Iron Company found it hard to retain miners, even though they would pay $4.25 a day. Very good for that time. That is a great shot of Floresta. And you can see it at 10,000 feet deep in the timber, still very isolated today. The numerous rolls and faults in the mine, heavy concentrations of gas, and the fact that the mine usually was closed from December to May made Floresta unattractive. In 1898, the largest coal breaker west of Pennsylvania was built in Floresta at a cost of $98,000. And there you see it, 5 stories high, 114 feet high, 76 feet wide, 124 feet long, handling 2,000 tons of anthracite coal every 24 hours. The coal from the 3-foot wide veins slid down steel chutes to waiting coal cars below. Mules hauled the cars out of the mine to the tramway. From there, the coal was taken 1,400 feet down to the tipple at the breaker and dumped. From the top of the breaker, the coal passed through 5 huge revolving screens and was broken up into 5 sizes, before it got to the bins on the lowest floor, just above the railroad tracks. The coal was then loaded onto the railroad cars and headed east, where it was used both as an industrial and domestic fuel. Floresta had many cabins for families. They get a good shot of the post office and some of the miners in front of the post office right around 1900. Floresta had many cabins for families, 9 houses for CF&I officers, a huge boarding house which housed 90 men, its own sawmill, Colorado supply store, a Western Union telegraph office, and a school which ran for 15 to 20 students during the summer. Between 1898, when the breaker was built, and 1918, 20 years later, when operations ended, Floresta turned out 800,000 tons of anthracite coal, all turned out roughly from May to December. It ended as an anthracite town after World War I came to an end in 1918. The end of the war, the long distance from markets, and the difficulty of keeping the railroad open for more than 6 months out of the year ended things. The 1 million ton slag dump was sold during the 1920s, and the Denver and Rio Grande pulled up its tracks in 1929. Today, Floresta is owned by a couple from Texas, 1,650 acres. They got a beautiful home there, they got a barn there, and they want to restore it. They do not want to sell 35-acre plots or anything like that. They're doing a real nice job. That takes care of Floresta. Meanwhile, what about other coal mines near Crested Butte? Well, you're getting a great look at the Horace mine just south of town. And that one really shows, you can see where the coal came out of the mine up above, down the tramway into the tipple, and then loaded on the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, the Denver Rio Grande Railroad cars. And in those railroad cars, usually about 80 to 100 of them, were pulled all the way through the East River Valley, through Gunnison, up to Meechee Creek, and then 2 or 3 engines took them over Marshall Pass into Salida. When they got to Salida, the narrow gauge cars had to be transferred to broad gauge cars because you had a broad gauge track running from Salida all the way to Pueblo. And what they had there was a barrel roller. And a barrel roller was a big machine that picked up a narrow gauge car and dumped it upside down with its contents going into the broad gauge car. 3 narrow gauge cars, coal, could fit in a broad gauge car, and then it was on to Pueblo. There are miners and a mule out by the Peanut Mine on today's lower loop. Now, as I said, the other mines included the Pershing and the Peanut on the lower loop just northwest of town. There's a great shot of the Peanut in the 1920s. The Robinson, Buckley, and Horace mine just south of Crested Butte, and you just saw them. There's another great shot of the Peanut mine, and you can see the mine and then the tramway going to the tipple, and then the Rio Grande Railroad ran right over there. Now, the railroad tracks ran right along the lower loop bike trail today. The road down below is a regular road. There's a great shot of the Peanut and Peanut Lake around 1920. And there is a shot of the Buckley mine. That one is south of town, and you can see the fumes coming out of the mine. When the big mine closed in 1952 and railroad tracks were pulled up 3 years later, Crested Butte's population, once 1,800, plummeted to 300. People had to leave. There was no work. There is a great shot of the Denver and Rio Grande, a coal train going around Jack's cabin. You can see the Crested Butte Mountain in the background and Round Mountain over on the right. In the 1950s, one could buy a lot in Crested Butte for $50. You could buy a home for $500. There's the CF&I Hotel, now known as the Elk Mountain Lodge in Crested Butte. Many of Crested Butte's miners and their families moved to Pueblo, Trinidad, or Paonia, where they could still be involved with coal mining or in the steel mills. The Denver Post declared in the late 1950s that Crested Butte was on its way to becoming a ghost town. But In 1961, everything changed and the age of snow beckoned. Now, there you get a great shot of the 152 steps that took you all the way up to the bench. You can see the railroad car with coal on the right, and you can see the CF&I big mine on the right. Dick Eflin and Fred Rice bought the Molensic Ranch on the base of Crested Butte Mountain in 1961. And then, with permission from the Forest Service, began the Crested Butte ski area. And the rest, they say, is history. Crested Butte's population is now 1,600. 6,000 people live in the north end of the Gunnison country. They live in Crested Butte, River Bend, Crested Butte South, Mount Crested Butte, Trappers Crossing, and other areas. The Crested Butte School, which closed as a high school in 1967, was revived in 1999. And now I just talked to Leslie Nichols, the superintendent today. She was getting fitted for ski boots, says that there are about 750 students in the school. And Crested Butte has gone through 2 editions, and in 2022, with the passage of the bond issue, is ready to undergo another. Times today look good for the old town. Ski area, the incredible beauty of the Elk Mountains, the highly rated school, the great mountain bike trails, beautiful wildflowers have made Crested Butte one of the most beautiful places in the world to be. And that is the story of one of the great coal towns in the American West, Crested Butte. And now, before we finish off today, I got a little something extra for you. There are some unique things about the Gunnison country, and I won't give them all to you, but I'm going to give you some as we finish off the 8 episodes. 80% of the land in the Gunnison country is federal. Cottonwood Pass at 12,126 feet is the highest mountain pass, paved pass over the Continental Divide in the United States. First chairlift in Colorado, Pioneer, 1939 and 40. Western State College, first college on the Western Slope, 1911. The Gunnison country with Moab, Utah, one of the top 2 mountain biking areas in the U.S. and maybe in the world. The first great Bureau of Reclamation project was the Gunnison Tunnel, 1909, taking Gunnison River water to the Uncompahgre Valley. Along with northwestern Colorado, the Gunnison country had the first great cattle-sheep conflict in the West. The Gunnison country is the top pure white marble quarry in the nation. Turned out the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and the Lincoln Memorial. I'm listening to the public radio today. I didn't know it. Marble is the state rock of Colorado. Didn't know that. Aberdeen Granite Quarry turned out stone for the Colorado State Capitol building, the outside. Marble from Marble, Colorado, used on the inside. And finally, the Gunnison country was the first where sustainability first became known as successful at high elevation. Now, I got a lot more, but that'll wait until the spring. So we now go to the trivia questions, and Ashley is going to tell you how we answer the trivia questions. Now, this is for the big book. So, Ashley, you're on.
Okay, Dwayne's gonna ask
3 questions.
3. Well, that's gonna be kind of hard to. Okay. Let's see here. Let me just make this bigger then. So there's gonna be 3 questions today, and I would suggest writing it down. But yeah, first person who answers all 3 in the chat box wins.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. Jim, the answer to your question is Buckley is spelled B-U-C-K-L-E-Y. You're exactly right. Here are the questions. Number 1, we'll give you a little time. I want the 3 different types of coal produced by Crested Butte mines. Question number 2, who were the cousin Jacks? And question number 3, I want to know what the largest coal breaker was west of Pennsylvania in 1898. So we await the answer. We're looking at the chat box. A couple of answers coming in. Charles Bailey's got one, not correct yet. We're awaiting the answer for the big book. Anthracite, bituminous, and coking coal. I'll give you that one. Wait a minute. Here's John Jeremy. Anthracite, bituminous, coking, English miners, and the Floresta breaker. Very good. Jeremy. John Dro, Jeremy, give us your address, and the book is going to be on the way.
Congratulations.
Yeah, congratulations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, any questions or comments following our final podcast? Remember, we'll be talking to Ashley and Melinda and the powers that be here, and we're probably going to have another one coming up in the spring, so stay tuned to the website. Any comments or questions? I want to thank all 180 people for being on board.
Thanks, Susan.
Yeah, thank you for, yeah, you bet. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, Mr. Patton, happy holidays. Yeah, Merry Christmas to everybody. Happy holidays. Stay warm. Any other comments or questions?
Jeremy, make sure you send us your, wait.
Yeah, Bill, thank you. We'll have a great year of skiing and hopefully see you in the spring. Yeah, John, your book is going to be on the way, incidentally. Chris, yeah, thanks very much for the kind words. Vicky, thank you for comments. Yeah, Keith Fulmer, thank you very much for being on board. Appreciate all the kind comments. Oh, good. Dan Bender's going to be at the Palisades tomorrow. Yeah, Dan, we'll see you for Liar's Poker.
What's the Palisades?
Yeah, in Gunnison. Yeah, Catherine, thank you very much. We will hopefully see you. I don't know if you're going to make it for the polka or not. Pete Dunda, thank you. Nancy Rowe, thank you.
Yes, Patton, yes.
Yeah, Mr. Patton says, remember to donate to the museum before year's end. I want to remind everybody that that great raffle goes to the 28th. Just get on board on the website, and a couple of great prizes. Any other comments or questions, ladies and gentlemen? Jamie, thanks a lot. Gary, thanks a lot. Who owns Smith Hill before Smith? Smith bought it, Gary, from the Jennings brothers.
Wait, I had some questions. Okay, my question is, when the strikes were happening, hold on, wait, when the strikes, or no, when the mine shut down for 30 days, did the miners get paid?
They got paid some from the United Mine Workers, but many of them went to work in some of the other mines that were not part of the CF&I.
And then my other question was, when the bodies were identified and tagged, you said that they were moved to the mine to the blacksmith shop, and this building used to be a blacksmith shop. Was it this building or was it somewhere closer to the mine? You think?
No. It was up on the bench.
Okay.
The blacksmith shop up on the bench.
That would have been real
Keith
creepy.
Fulmer says, does Pete play Dark as a Dungeon? I'll let Pete answer that. Karen Peterson, Karen, so nice to have you on board. Pete and Susan threw a great Christmas party a few days ago, one of the highlights of the year. Any other comments or questions, everybody? If not, thanks a lot for being on board. Thanks to our sponsors, Vandenbush and O'Hara. Over and out.
Bye, guys. Have a great Christmas. Thank you.